Chapter 4. Before the day was over, the pleasant weather gave way to rain. In an hour, the wagon cover was soaked, and if one touched it, drops of water came through to drip on whatever lay beneath bedding, clothing, or an upturned face. The canvas was old and mildewed since Papa had bought it years before when the family first moved westward from Ohio. When it was wet, the smell was sickening. So, mildewed means mold. So, it had mold on it. And when the mold got wet, it smelled horrible. The constant jolting of the springless wagon added to their misery. Catherine was the first to be sick to her stomach, but soon all her sisters and Mamma became ill, groaning at each lurch and sway. Papa, sitting out in the fresh air, guessed that they had eaten too much breakfast. Mamma said riding in the wagon was as bad as a ship. They were seasick. They were bumping around so much. Papa was so eager to catch up with the rest of the wagon train that he kept going until late at night, then camped in the road. At the first sign of daylight, they started on again. In a few days of hard driving, they reached the place where the roads from Independence and Liberty joined the St. Joseph Trail. Here, all the wagons had stopped, and the men were holding meetings to organize for the long trip ahead. Although this year of 1844, more than 1,400 men, women, and children had come together in 250 wagons with several thousand cattle. Obviously, they could not all travel in this as a unit. Someone suggested they should divide into companies, like an army. This sounded like a good idea. They elected a general and 4 captains and drew lots to divide the rest. The Saggers were assigned the company headed by Captain William Shaw. He and his wife had 5 boys and 1 girl and took an interest in all the families in their company. The captain soon knew everyone's name, and Mrs. Shaw became Aunt Sally to all the children. So they broke up into groups. So you can kind of think about it as if you're playing outside at recess and you have some team captains, and then the rest of the people get chosen to be in different groups. So they're split up into different teams or different parties, and they're going to travel in a smaller group because 1,400 people, that's way too many people to go at once. Once the train was underway, the men drilled in military style every evening and took turns standing guard through the night. A young man who had brought his drum sounded the calls for duty. Even the children took to drilling. It was all fun and exciting for a week or two. Then, since nothing happened, the men stopped drilling and even neglected to set guards. One morning, a number of cattle were missing. Captain Shaw studied the tracks in the dust and said Indians had come in the night. Those who had lost cattle leaped onto their horses and set out to find them. But it was no use. After this, everyone was alert to the least sound that might mean an attack. Late one evening, when a gunshot cracked, the whole camp burst into an uproar. Papa leaped into the wagon, grabbed his gun, and rushed off into the darkness with John and Frank close behind him. Louise and Matilda began to scream. Catherine and Elizabeth, still feeling weak and sick, peeked out from under the canvas cover, but, dissatisfied with all they could see, crawled out to the wagon seat. All around them in the darkness, men were rushing toward the source of the gunshot, crying in a fearsome word, "Indians!" "Catherine, Elizabeth, come back inside," Mama commanded feebly, but the girls were too excited to obey. Suddenly, from far off across the campground, came muffled laughter mingled with swear words neither of the Sager girls had ever heard before. Papa appeared out of the darkness, grumbling and laughing at the same time. "Everyone is mad," he told Mama. "A fellow and his girl decided to enjoy a little stroll, and the guard mistook them for Indians. Lucky he was so nervous he missed them, or we would have had a funeral on our hands." So a boy and a girl that were falling in love went on a little walk, and they thought it was Indians. The next morning, the captain called a meeting and laid down strict rules about moving around the camp after the drum called out the night guards. One day, Mrs. Shaw came to see Mama. When she learned of the persistent seasickness, she said to Catherine, "You girls must get out and walk in the fresh air, rain or shine. You will soon feel better. Come on, I'll help you out." Catherine did not want to move, but Mama motioned her to go. She crawled out the back of the wagon, and Aunt Sally helped her to the ground. Elizabeth followed. Holding hands, they tottered along the road, and before long, they really did begin to feel better. The next day, they took Matilda and Louise with them. Only Mama said she could not walk. She lay on the feather bed almost all the time. The weather turning fine again. Everyone said hopefully that now the rains must be over. They settled down into an orderly routine. They broke camp early after a hearty breakfast, stopped for a cold lunch and a rest at noon, then resumed the march until later afternoon. Some days they made 20 miles. Other days no more than 10, depending on the condition of the road and the number of people who were injured or became ill. Far too many of both. In the Shaw Company, 2 persons died of camp fever, a strange illness, something like typhoid and pneumonia combined. At each death, the whole wagon train stopped while the grave was dug and a brief funeral service held. In spite of the gloom cast by these unfortunate events, the train moved forward and people soon recovered their high spirits. On warm evening, fiddlers, drums, and mouth organs tuned up, setting young feet to dancing. The evening became a medley of music, whirling calico skirts, snapping fingers, and laughter. So they're trying to have fun in the evenings together. Catherine and Elizabeth were allowed to sit on the wagon tongue. So hopefully you know where the tongue is because you've drawn a covered wagon and labeled the parts. For a while and watch, but Papa stayed in the wagon with Mama. Catherine guessed she must be sick, but when she asked Papa, he said, "No, she's only very tired. She'll be all right after a while." Catherine cooked the breakfast mush and sometimes the evening meal as well. Her brothers kept the fire going and Elizabeth unpacked the dishes from the big basket. Afterwards, they washed and dried them together, then repacked them for the next day. Sometimes Mama came out to eat, sometimes not. She hardly paid any attention to them, so they spent little time in the wagon, but ran, screamed, played, and fought with the other children as wild and unrestrained as young wild animals. One day, in the middle of the morning, Mama called out to Papa, "You'd better stop, Henry!" He drew the wagon off the road and yelled to John and Frank, who had been walking a little way ahead, to unyoke the oxen and let them back to the cattle column. Looking scared, they drove the oxen away on the run. Papa lifted out the 2 small girls, sent Elizabeth to bring Aunt Sally Shaw, and said to Catherine, "Take Matilda and Louise out somewhere away." Catherine stood silent and bewildered. What had happened? Was Mama dying? Captain Shaw rode along the line, shouting that the train would stop for the day. Aunt Sally ran up breathless, followed by Elizabeth, who looked as frightened as Catherine felt. Aunt Sally beckoned to them. "You girls take the little ones over by our wagon. My daughter will give you some dinner. You stay there till I tell you you can come back." All the way to the Shaw wagon, Catherine was aware of women standing in small groups near the halted team and of children staring at Elizabeth, Matilda, Louise, and her. What was wrong? Did Elizabeth know? She looked sideways at her sister, but she walked with her own head down, eyes on the ground. Catherine wanted to ask someone if Mama was dead, but she didn't dare. Obediently, she and her sister sat down in the shade of the wagon and ate the beans and bacon offered them. Then the Shaw girl went away and left them alone. The May afternoon was warm and sunny, the prairie bright with wildflowers, pink, blue, and yellow. Catherine led the way to where the flowers were thickest. She and Elizabeth braided them into wreaths for their little sisters, then coaxed them to lie on the grass for naps. For hours, the two of them sat in silence. Catherine had never felt so lonesome and neglected in all her life. She wanted to talk about it with Elizabeth, but somehow she could not. The sun was sinking when she heard Aunt Sally calling and ran to her wagon. "You children have a beautiful little baby sister," she said. "You may go and see her if you are very quiet. Your mama needs rest." A baby sister? Another little sister to be dressed and undressed? Thought Catherine. She did not want to see the baby, but Aunt Sally stood there waiting, and there was nothing else to do. She started toward their own wagon, and the others trailing behind. She climbed in and slowly crept along the floor to where Mama lay, smiling weakly. She drew back the blanket from a tiny, red, wrinkled face and said, "Isn't she sweet?" Catherine thought the baby was very ugly, but of course she could not say that to Mama. She whispered, "She's awfully little, isn't she?" "About the size of all my babies." "What are you going to name her?" Catherine inquired. "Papa has a sister named Rosanna. I thought that would be a pretty name for her." "Hello, Rosanna." She touched the doll-like hand, and the little fingers curled around one of her own. Something seemed to clutch at her heart. "My little sister," she thought, and loved her. "Write it in the Bible that she was born on the 31st of May," Mama whispered. Elizabeth came in next, then Matilda, both staring at the baby without saying anything. When Louise saw the baby in Mama's arms, she began to kick and scream. If Catherine had not held her hand, she would have struck the tiny red face. "Please take her out, Katie. You'll have to sleep in the tent with her and try to keep her quiet. She's jealous, but she'll get over it soon." John carried some of the blankets and a straw tick to the tent and made up a bed for the four girls. He and Frank said that they would sleep under the wagon. Mama would need Papa with her. Matilda, always a peaceable child, snuggled down by Elizabeth and promptly went to sleep. But Louise sobbed and cried and tried to break away from Catherine until she could fight no longer. She subsided in a small heap of misery just inside the tent flap. Too tired to try to move her, Catherine tucked a blanket over her and went to sleep herself. She had no idea what time of the night it was when she was roused by the smell of smoke and scorched wool and the sound of a child's voice wailing, "Mama, Mama!" Immediately she guessed what had happened. Louise had wakened and started out to find Mama, dragging her blanket through the embers of the campfire. Catherine screamed. John and Frank leapt up from under the wagon. Papa burst through the open canvas cover, and together they put out the fire. So her blanket went across the embers and caught fire. "It's no use, Naomi. I'll have to sleep in the tent. If you need me, call good and loud." He lay down across the tent opening, and Catherine once more held the shrieking Louise until she sobbed herself to sleep. Days passed before she would look at the baby without trying to strike her. All right, my friends, that was chapter 4. So back in those days when people had babies, they didn't necessarily write a birth certificate. You didn't have them in the hospital. And so what her family did is they had a family Bible. And in the front of the Bible, they would record everyone's birth or death or marriage, any important dates that they wanted to remember as a family. They would record in the Bible in the front cover. That's going to come up a little bit later, but you will see that Mama asked Catherine to write down the baby's birthday in the Bible as part of their family. So, chapter 4, new baby on the trail. All right, my friends, I'll talk to you later. Bye.